The stories I'm about to share with you are from The Tragedy at Devil's Hollow and Other Kentucky Ghost Stories by Michael Paul Henson. I would like to give thanks to those in assistance tonight, Mr. Chris Schaus, Ed Hughes, Clay Case, Miss Stacy Kindred, and Brody the Wonder Dog. The story tonight is titled Ghost Bride. In late July 1938, Martin Harmon received a telephone call at his wholesale grocery company's office in Whitesburg, Kentucky, asking him to come to Harlan, Kentucky. A coal company had opened a new commissary and wanted a complete line of groceries and tools delivered, but needed a salesman to make a list before they could place such a large order. It was late in the day when Harmon left Whitesburg, but because the mountain roads were in poor condition and because a storm seemed imminent, he decided to leave on his trip at once. It was beginning to get dark when he reached the other side of Pine Mountain, and he found himself in a regular cloudburst. The rumbling thunder seemed to shake the mountain, and flashes of lightning created an eerie world out of the darkness. High winds hurled tree limbs and other debris into the road, slowing Harmon's progress. There was not a place within miles where he could hope to get a night's lodging. He had to keep going. He had turned a sharp curve in the winding road, and when he almost lost control of his car, there beside the road was a young woman, waving for him to stop. He could see by his headlights that she was dressed in a wedding gown. He pulled to a stop, and the girl approached the car. Her dark hair was rain-soaked, and her face had a gray pallor. She seemed to be in a state of shock. In an almost hysterical voice, she told him that the bridge he would have to cross on the poor fork of the Cumberland River had washed away in the storm, that she and a girlfriend had driven into the swollen stream, and that her friend had drowned. She then told him he should not drive down into the valley, but should instead take another road a few hundred yards ahead. Harmon asked the girl if he could help her. She replied that her name was Colleen Tyler, that she lived on the road she knew to be safe, and she would just like a ride that far. When the young woman sat down beside him, Harmon noticed that she was developing a chill. He placed his coat around her shoulders, but she seemed not to notice. Her head was turned and she kept looking out the window into the storm, as if she were searching for something or someone. Asking for directions, Harmon was told to turn onto a gravel road. Though it continued to rain and occasional flashes of lightning could still be seen, and the rumble of thunder came from the mountain, the worst of the storm was over. Harmon was curious about the girl, wondering why she was dressed in bridal attire, and what is she doing on a lonely mountain road at night in such a storm. But he didn't question her. She seemed to be still in shock and continued to stare vacantly out the car window. After about half an hour, they arrived at her home. The rain had stopped. She thanked him, and as Harmon watched her in his car's headlights, she walked around the house to what he assumed was the back door. Harmon drove on toward Harlan before he remembered that Colleen still had his coat around her shoulders. But he was now in a hurry to continue his trip and decided to stop by on his return. The small frame house would be easy to find because it had the only white board fence he had seen along the gravel road. The next morning in Harlan, Harmon learned that the bridge Colleen had told him about had indeed washed away during the storm of the previous night. 2 men had drowned when their car ran into the stream, for they had failed to see that the bridge was gone. But no one else was reported drowned. Harmon was now more than ever determined to stop and thank Colleen for her warning, which had almost certainly saved his life. After finishing his business, Harmon started on his return trip to Whitesburg, following the route Colleen had shown him. He arrived at her house within a few hours. An elderly white-haired lady answered his knock and stared at him in disbelief as Harmon introduced himself and told her briefly of his experience the night before. "I am Colleen's mother," the woman said, and you have to be mistaken. It couldn't have been my daughter, because she drowned 4 years ago in just such a storm as we had last night. You had to have seen someone else." She explained that Colleen and a friend had been on their way to church in the valley where Colleen was to be married. The rest of the family had already gone to the church and were waiting when the storm started. Not knowing the bridge had been washed away, the two young ladies drove their car into the river, and both were drowned. Colleen's body had been recovered and was buried in the family cemetery, a short distance behind the house. It was Harmon's turn to stare. Mrs. Tyler said, "I'll show you her grave." Harmon remembered as they walked across the yard and around the house that Colleen had been walking this way when he last saw her. As they neared the cemetery, Mrs. Tyler continued, "Since it was to have been her wedding day, we decided to bury Colleen in her wedding gown. We thought she would have liked that." When they came to Colleen's grave, they were both amazed and stood speechless. For there, draped over the headstone, was Harmon's coat and a still damp bridal veil. Author's note: I can learn of no such sighting of this phantom within the last 30 years, but the ghost of the bride-to-be was seen on several occasions during the 30s and 40s, either near where the old bridge crossed the Poor Fork of the Cumberland River or along the road that used to pass close by. The apparition was always seen during or just before a heavy rain. You never know.